Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. E na rōrangatira mā, no mai haere mai whakatau mai, ki tēnei hui mariko. Ko Barry Coates-aho, ko te karahi o te putea whai whakaro. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good evening to you all. I'm Barry Coates. I'm founder and CEO of the charity Mindful Money. A warm welcome to you all. Mindful Money has a mission to empower investors to invest in line with their values. As well as the transparency and the tools on our website, we undertake these seminars to highlight how investment can make a difference on issues that matter. So the panel that we are about to enjoy, we'll have a discussion for about 30 minutes and then we'll open up for questions. Please use the Q&A button to ask your question at any stage in the seminar. You don't have to wait until the end. In fact, it'd be great if you don't, because it's always nice to have a stack of questions ready to ask. For your information, this is the 10th seminar in this current series. This is actually the second series we've done. And you can see the Mindful Money website for recordings on issues of climate change, net zero, social housing, impact investing. And last week, a seminar on modern slavery focusing on labour rights. Tonight, we're talking about a different aspect of modern slavery. We're focusing on trafficking and exploitation of vulnerable people. And when Mindful Money and an organisation called RIA do our annual survey of the public to ask what issues are of most concern to the public when they're investing, the issue of human rights is always top of the agenda. So we have a great panel to join us for the discussion tonight of trafficking. So I'm pleased to welcome our first panelist, Ian McInnes. Ian's been the chief executive of Tearfund for the past 16 years, building innovative programs with local partners in the world's poorest countries. He's previously managed humanitarian relief programs in response to disasters, including the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. He's been the chair of several networks of International Disaster Relief Agency and chair of the New Zealand Council for International Development. Ian and I have worked together on a range of issues when I was CEO of Oxfam, which is now almost a decade ago. So it's really nice to see you again, Ian. A warm welcome.
Kia ora, Barry, and thank you very much for having me.
Cool. Ian, can I just kind of ask you the obvious question in a way? So Tearfund's an agency that challenges injustice that affect the world's most vulnerable and poorest people. What was it that led you to particularly trafficking as the issue that you wanted Tearfund to devote a major part of your program to?
Yeah, I think, Barry, historically, an agency like ours would have worked on the factors of poverty, in particular, access to productive land, and just helping lift people up, or lift themselves up and out of poverty. But I think increasingly what we've realised at Tearfund is many trapped in the cycle of poverty are outright exploited by others, and increasingly it's that brazen exploitation that holds people back and creates just so much risk and cycles people back through poverty. And so when you look at the statistics, 40 million slaves on earth today, 15 million of those are in forced marriages, right? The other 25 million are in forced labor of some sort. Within that, 1 in 5 are in sexual exploitation. Just an enormously profitable business. And it's out and out exploitative and very hard to remove oneself from. And so we wanted to get to grips with one of the most egregious crimes, if you like, on the planet, which is a pure and outright exploitation of humans, one by another, trapping people in immense hardship and poverty.
And so the argument is really that you can't really deal with poverty unless you deal with issues like trafficking that are underlying causes.
Yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword. You have to go after both at the same time. You have to go after the the reasons for poverty, and you have to go after those who exploit it, and those who make the most of it.
Can you tell us a bit about the way you work, about how you address trafficking issues? Because I know it's quite an integrated approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So just quickly, Barry, there's 5 P's sort of in our work. There's the prevention, the prosecution, the policy work, the partnership work, and the protection element. And so, but just quickly, you really have to work across all of those. Prevention, which is classic poverty alleviation work and education, is crucial. And so we find up in Nepal, we're working to help prevent women and girls get trapped in a huge human migration down into the more wealthy India, if you like. In the protection side, removing victims from harm and creating survivors from those situations, onto rehabilitative care and reintegration in communities, and that's of course quite a project for any aid agency. At the policy end, it's crucial, and so where we can influence legislation, policy, a judiciary to act more on the situation, we will. We do have quite an extensive program in Thailand in that regard. Prosecution, there's an awful statistic. Less than 1% of those trafficked will ever see a justice for their crime. And so really you have so few traffickers going through the legal system or facing the courts. And finally, you need partnership. You can't do it alone. Criminal enterprises at this scale, the scale of human trafficking, are incredibly well networked and resourced. So do those who combat them need to be. And that's a combination of state, NGOs, local communities. It really does take a joined up approach to combat it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Ian. Let me turn to our other panelist. Let me welcome George Carter. Hi, George. George is the Managing Director of Nikko Asset Management. Nikko manages $8 billion of assets in New Zealand for a range of clients, including KiwiSaver schemes, institutional clients, philanthropic organizations, financial planners, and retail investors. George was previously head of distribution for AMP Capital and has been a consultant for Mercer New Zealand. Warm welcome to you, George.
Thanks, good evening, Barry. Good to be here.
George, in a way, a sort of parallel question to the one I asked to Ian. What was it about the issue of trafficking that really made you want Nikko to get involved and support this issue?
There's probably a few aspects to that, I guess, Barry. And clearly, and as Ian alluded to, this is a massive global issue. And I think the bit that surprised me is I've spent the last couple of years looking into the issue and talking with Tearfund about the work that they're doing here. I think it's still relatively poorly understood amongst the Western world. We're familiar with understanding some of the historical abuses in slavery and trafficking. We're familiar with, in ancient cultures, we talk about Roman slaves and we study that at school, etc. But the concept of modern trafficking, I think, it's still very much a live problem in the world today, and we need to put resources into solving it. And so work that can both help the issue in terms of resolving the problems, but also raising awareness of the problem so that the decisions that we make as consumers, as investors, as to how we behave is also going to be helpful with dealing with the problem. And it aligns so well with corporate values of what we're wanting to see around reduced inequality and decent conditions for better economic growth and prosperity in our world.
So given that impulse that you wanted to do something on trafficking, what then led you to design the fund you've launched, the Freedom Fund?
The Freedom Fund. So the genesis of that idea, and we'll talk about this more maybe in a few minutes, but the sort of the raw concept is, how do we use our professional skills, which we're good at managing assets and managing money, how can we use those skills in order to provide an income stream that helps work against the blight that is modern trafficking, modern slavery and human trafficking? That's one area. And then the second element, and Ian touched on it when he talked about partnership, is that we also want to enable others to join in this work. And so if we can manage people's assets that they give to us to manage, where we can generate an income stream to help alleviate poverty in this particular way, then it's about Tearfund using their expertise in the field, us using our expertise in managing money and enabling everyday Kiwis to use their assets and their resources in order to join this particular fight. So it's working together with our respective skill sets to achieve the outcome that we're trying to get.
Good. And do you just want to talk a little bit about how the Freedom Fund works, how it's designed?
Maybe the first thing to note is that it's quite different to how you might think about giving towards charity. Normally, if we think about giving to charity, you open your wallet and you give a $5, $20, $50 donation or whatever you want to give to charity. And once you've given that money, the charity goes and uses it. The Freedom Fund's a little bit different. What the Freedom Fund's saying is you'll probably have some money set at a bank account somewhere that's maybe earning very, very little or maybe even zero interest. What the proposition is would you let us manage that money? We'll put that to work in the bond markets and in the equity markets. And the return that we can generate off those assets, we will take that and gift that to the charity. And if we can do that in a way, the fee that we generate from that, we donate as well. So it's effectively fee-free to investors because that goes across the charity. Everybody running the fund behind the scenes is doing it at no cost. So there's no costs involved. And the IRD has confirmed that because all of the upside is gifted to charity, there's no tax as well. So it's a tax-free, cost-free, fee-free approach to generating an income stream or return to help fight slavery.
Good. Thank you for that, George. Let me bring Ian back in. Let's talk sort of not only about the specifics, but actually about how investment can tackle trafficking more broadly. This is a huge problem, as you said. For those statistics, we're talking about 25 million people in forced labor. What are some of the ways that you think are most promising that can scale up beyond what any single agency can do? How can this be addressed more systematically and really start to tackle the problem at scale?
Well, I think seeing exactly what Nikko AM have done is incredibly impressive. Try to create there with investors a sustainable and ongoing revenue stream that can fund this work. And to give you an example, in our prosecution work in sort of Thailand's ground zero for that, for us, we have a partner up there, and it's perhaps not your ordinary NGO. That they really have. They have intelligence officers and then an analytics crew, investigators. And so they are about every 10 days putting a case through the Thai courts. And the problem's not going away, but that cost, it's about $10,000 per case end to end to investigate, arrest, prosecute, and we're highly effective at prosecuting. The Thai courts work, which is fantastic. Case lawyer, the one case lawyer we have there, is run off her feet. And I know it was hearing her story that sort of moved George as well. She has a habit of sleeping under her desk, just burning the candle at both ends to get cases through the court on time. Unlike in New Zealand, where the Crown Prosecutor might prosecute, in Thailand, the prosecutor will stand up and often take a seat and hand over to our lawyer to prosecute the case on behalf of the Thai state. But she's her and all costs are around $47,000 a year in New Zealand, and so clearly this is not free work. It does cost, and yet to give you an idea of how effective she is, in the time she's served with us on this work, she has acquired 177 convictions as of today in Thailand, and clocked up 3,200 years of jail time. On convicts, and that's a lot of folks. We estimate that a human trafficker will move up to 24 people a year, and so you really are talking an inordinate number of people protected. Every time you put a trafficker behind bars, we do that. We put them behind bars for an average of 20 years. And so we really do believe we are starting to make a dent in the problem in Thailand, notably making it much riskier. So the partnership element is, of course, with the Royal Thai Police, the Department of Special Investigations, their version of the FBI, local NGOs who feed through intelligence and information for us to analyse and get to work on, communities who hear about us and put the flag up and raise the alarm, which is why I said it does take a network to bring down a network in the area of human trafficking.
Yeah. So it's that issue of working with local organisations, civil society, as well as through and with the government. That is
Just very briefly on the government, there's a piece of legislation we're working on at the moment on grooming. You know, legislation often trails, and yet the Thais are realising this is quite serious. If they can get this legislation through and make it a criminal offence to groom children for sex, it becomes much easier to prevent the sorts of crimes that we then have to go on and prosecute. So that would be just one more example of how one can partner well to bring arguably a systemic and permanent change to a country like Thailand.
And George, what's the response been from people in the investment community to a program like this? Because it's it's unusual for New Zealand Investment Fund to give money directly to charity.
Yeah, I'd say the response has been extremely supportive. And I mean, a good example of that would be that when I first came up with the idea of the Freedom Fund, it was only going to work if we could run this really at zero cost. So I contacted our lawyers and our accountants, a supervisor, regulator, and I said, if we can put a fund together like this, would you be prepared to provide all your services at no charge? And the answer came back immediately, which is, of course we would. That'd be absolutely. We'd be pleased to help you in that way, which is a remarkable gift of time and energy and effort, not just in the running of the fund, but in the 2 years it took us to set it all up and to work through all of the practicalities and systems changes and coding changes and technical and legal aspects to make this fund operationally viable. But maybe just jumping back to Pic's story, so she's the lawyer up in Thailand, and she gave an example of a case, and I know we haven't got too much time, but basically managed to identify some children that were being abused in Thailand. She talked about how they'd gone in to extract the kids from this particular situation and bring the offender to justice. And you could tell from her presentation just how much work was involved in something like that. And so I had a chat with her afterwards, and I said, "What's the biggest constraint around your work?" And not surprisingly, the answer came back that I was probably expecting, which is, I'm just one lawyer. There's only so many hours in the day. There's only so much work that I can do. And clearly, in order to fund this work, there needs to be an ongoing stream of income that can provide the confidence, I suppose, to hire another person and put the support networks in place to be able to ramp up and do more of that type of work, which got me thinking, well, that's what we do. Our job and our living is to invest assets to create income streams. That's really how we think about investment markets. So why not create a fund that does exactly that says we can take money from New Zealanders who care about this issue and who are interested in it, and they'll say we will effectively lend you our money. You can use our money to generate an income stream, and if we need our money back, they just contact us and we hand them the money back. So in the meantime, we've put their money to good use in the markets to help fight this issue.
Do you see other funds being established in New Zealand? Is this something that you would anticipate becomes more common?
Well, in theory, there's nothing stopping that. We've established that the structures can be built and done, and so if others had a particular cause or area that they wished to do that for, I mean, the success or otherwise of something like this ultimately depends on people wanting to put their assets in behind it. If we only raise $50,000, then it doesn't really. You've got all the cost and difficulties of running a fund for such small money. It doesn't really work. We're hoping that we can raise somewhere between $3 and $5 million, which sounds like quite a lot of money, but you break it down, you think that's 3,000 people each putting $1,000 aside, and that money's still there if you need it back one day. That's $3 million. We generate, say, a 2% return on that. That's $60,000. That's funded a lawyer and a case each year in Thailand to help with this work.
So there are other fund managers in New Zealand that give money to charity, obviously. So Simplicity or Pathfinder or Generate or quite a few others. And they often do it as a percent of their fees or something else, but they spread it amongst a number of charities. This is quite unique insofar as you're dedicating the income from the fund to a particular organisation and a particular cause. What do you see the advantages of that?
The difference here is, I mean, the scale is just multiples more. So if you let's take $1 million, and the fee on running that fund might be, say, let's say you're charging 0.3%. So you've got a fee of what's that, $3,000, and you choose to give half of that away. So the charity gets $1,500. Okay, that's something. But you generate a 2% return on that $1 million, and you suddenly got $20,000. Then you give your fee on top of that. That's $23,000. The difference between $1,500 and $23,000, you can see that it's a whole quantum scale difference, because we're not just saying we're going to give a bit of our profits away. And we could do that, but that's just us giving a bit of our money. What we're wanting to do is create a structure and a system where anybody in New Zealand can get behind and say, I want to be a part of this too. And then when you build up the scale of doing that, and the entire investment return gets given to the charity, well, now we can talk some serious numbers and make some change.
Good. That's a good example. Thank you. Ian, the issues of trafficking are not confined to Southeast Asia. You've also started doing work in the Pacific. Can you describe what kind of work you're doing there?
Yeah, the New Zealand Aid Program, run by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, has cemented relationships with us and other charities for 5-year programs in the Pacific, and we're bringing two components of our work together, two long-standing components. One is this protection of women, children and boys, sometimes men, from human trafficking and other exploitation, and the other is upgrading and improving people's livelihoods, typical agricultural livelihoods, and that's another strong string to our bow. They may seem vastly different, but they work very much together in communities where you have small subsistence communities or one or two products that they're selling. It's important that people get established economically and become viable so as to reduce their vulnerability to exploitation. It's also important when people are removed from exploitative situations that they're put on their feet and enabled to go forward with scholarships or sponsorships or training or reskilling, and not fall back into the being trafficked or into an exploitative lifestyle. So we brought that together, and really you have MFAT wanting to know where the problems lie in the Solomon Islands, where we're working, in Fiji, where we're working, in Vanuatu. And you might think, oh, these are lovely places in the Pacific. Well, they are, but they have some issues. And so in things like fishing fleets in the Solomons, and in the forestry sector there in palm oil up in Fiji and the Bakasuva, where women come in from the outer islands and get trapped in quite an exploitative lifestyle. And really not much has been done on that, and not much in the investigation, identification and prosecution of cases, let alone the community empowerment to sort of identify and act on that early to stop the exploitation in the first place. So that's our target going forward across elements of the Pacific.
Yeah.
And Ian, I'm guessing, sorry Barry, just to jump in there, I'm guessing Ian, that raising of that awareness is just so important, because as consumers we can do a lot more with how we think about the things that we source, in terms of the products that we buy or the content that we consume online and those sorts of areas. And I think part of this is, it's not just about saying, could you let Nikko invest your money for a period of time to help Tearfund fight this, but also what other ways can we raise awareness so that people's whole lifestyle and choices does not inadvertently contribute towards this issue as well.
I think World Vision just came out with a statistic on that as they push through for modern slavery legislation. The average Kiwi household or individual in a household spends, say, $34 a week on dubious goods for which slavery can be well identified in their supply chains. Tearfund has long held the ethical fashion guide in the public space and graded fashion labels A to F. If you're down on an F grade, you're not really doing anything at all to determine where slavery is in your supply chain, and that can be cotton out of the back of China or Uzbekistan, or that can be right through to the bolts of cloth, or through to those who are putting the garments together in 4 million women, in Bangladesh alone. And so what are the conditions in those factories? And I think consumers are more and more aware today and want to know, if I buy a piece of clothing or a piece of technology, is there slavery? Is there slavery putting that together, or is that slave free? What do I it is not easy, but I think it's really important. And that's the other part of what we do. Of course, we consume as well as save. And so I think we really need to be looking at both those channels in our lives.
Yeah, and there have been some documented evidence of exploitation and trafficking in New Zealand supply chains. Obviously, fishing has been the subject of investigations, horticulture, agriculture, food service work. Do you think so there is an obligation now emerging on companies to step up and manage slave labour in their supply chains? Do you think New Zealand legislation is going to make a significant difference? Because there's a fair bit of debate from the UK and Australia where they do have legislation that it's become a bit of a tick box exercise and perhaps the legislation hasn't really made a difference.
It's always a fear.
I don't think the legislation. Go ahead, George.
So I was going to say it's always a fear that legislation and regulation becomes a tick box exercise in multiple areas, and you talk, Barry, about the importance of aligning your investments and what you're trying to do with your assets aligned with your personal values. And we see it a bit sort of both ways, which is that there are things that people do in their personal lives that they'd be ashamed to find out are happening on in their investments. But it also happens the other way, that people are quite happy to put bans and restrictions on what they're doing on their investments, but then they happily go about their lives as if they don't care about that issue at all. And so it's very easy to end up with either tick boxing or virtue signaling or greenwashing or all those sorts of elements which seek to actually not really fight the very issues that we care about. So I don't think that's an argument for not putting the legislative protections and frameworks in place. But these things are really only going to have an impact if people actually change their behaviors. And it doesn't matter what issue we're talking about. It happens to be today that we're talking about trafficking and slavery. But if you want to see change in something, you need to change your behaviors. And so if you want to see less people being exploited in fishing fleets, you need to find out about what food and produce is coming through those lines. If you want to think about your clothes, you need to look at where the cotton's coming from and think about what exploitation is in the production of the cotton and the clothes. Do you actually look at the label in your clothes? Do you see where it's manufactured? There's so many different ways that we can do these things, as well as putting our money to work in things like the Freedom Fund and gifting money towards Tearfund.
And
Ian?
Barry, I'd just add that I think there's a special onus on companies. Look, consumers are busy, and we do pitch, for example, our ethical fashion guide to them, but we go after companies because they have the resources on the whole. And even if they're small New Zealand companies have proven they can track their supply chains. I mean, of course they can track them. They do so very well in terms of making sure that they have garments on the shelf. So it's just a matter of asking the right questions of who's working in those outsourced factories and further up that supply chain. And that would be the same for food. And so I don't think we're seeing legislation with teeth yet, because I think in the UK, Canada and Australia, we're simply seeing legislation introduced and companies asked to get on board. And I think they are now. And this started with the collapse, of Rana Plaza, 10 years ago in Bangladesh, where hundreds of workers died at their sewing machines. And so it became obvious that these were very unsafe conditions. Forget the trafficking. That was just an unsafe building to be working in. And so really now I think we'll see that legislation start to stiffen and ask a little more. There really aren't significant penalties, and it's a voluntary compliance in many ways in terms of what one produces for information. The next step is to say, can we see the audit trail, please, and just how thorough is that? And
also, there is a unique role for government regulation enforcing transparency, because it's very hard for consumers to find out what's in their supply chain and under what conditions their products are produced. There's a plethora of different labels and certification schemes, and often people end up, with an overload of information that they don't know what to trust. So I guess we can look forward to the legislation. Hopefully it will go through. Hopefully it'll learn the lessons from other countries and have a bit more impact. George, on the investment side, the issue of modern slavery has really become somewhat of a sort of a rallying cry for many investment funds, and they're looking at ways that they can take action to make sure that there aren't companies with modern slavery in their funds. Do you think there are good examples of funds that are excluding companies that might have modern slavery in their supply chains, or is it still early days, or is it also some good examples of finding modern slavery and then influencing those companies to tighten up their policies?
Yeah, I think it's still early days. I think rather than the exclusion route at this stage, when most people are working on is still engagement. So, for example, if you knew categorically that there was slavery involved in your supply chain, I think that most companies would swiftly end that. I think it's the turning the blind eye, it's pretending that you don't know, it's making supply chains so long and cumbersome that you actually lose visibility of what's going on. And so it's more to do with how do you remove ignorance from the system? Because we know it's there, we know it's going on, and nobody's going to be directly associated with it, because if there were, that would be clamped out and stamped on pretty efficiently, I think, under even current regulation and structures. The issue is, how do you unearth and deliberately try to unearth? And I think with raising the profile of the issue and forcing companies to be able to get better certification and look through on their supply chains, we can actually just lift this and raise it to the surface a bit more. And that's going to be a case of engagement and ongoing timeframes, so that we can see the big producers doing a better job of being able to demonstrate and show that slavery is not in their supply chains, rather than just simply saying, I'm not aware of any, therefore it's fine.
In last week's seminar, we talked about labour rights, and there was a particular company called Top Glove that makes rubber gloves in Malaysia, and that has become a bit of a rallying point for labour rights. But the interesting thing from the conversation was the central role that the US government played in essentially banning exports of Top gloves into the United States, and that then became a kind of signal for others to do so. Are you seeing the same on trafficking, Ian? Are you seeing that there are some border protections, some of the international agencies now starting to clamp down on trafficking in a way that can really generate more of an international response?
I think we're starting to see that. I think it's slow. We've questioned tuna in New Zealand, off Thai and Malaysian fishing fleets. I mean, you have Rohingya refugees and Sri Lankans working on those ships. Some of those men never set foot on land again, or they come on once a year and go out again, and they're owed a year's back wages. So really, people often think it's just women and girls. It's men as well in the labour market. Interestingly, MB in New Zealand, it's predominantly men, which I found quite interesting. It made me think, well, they probably haven't found the women yet. They'll be there too. But who were labour trafficked in New Zealand, they had 51 cases, and they say that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think it's a bit hodgepodge, the targeting of products, and I suspect the EU in the US, and I didn't hear the podcast, you might have one hot topic, in rubber gloves, and so that's acted on, and Congress feels it has to do something. But, it won't be the only thing, and there'll be a raft of them. And how do you form a better regime that captures those more routinely, that looks at them in a more sober way more often, and makes firm decisions about what products will and will not come from what jurisdictions, because there is zero proof that this is not slave-free, or there's ample evidence that it does have slavery in its chain. I mean, we've gone after clothing, but of course there's no legislative framework for that in New Zealand. We're a pressure group, if you want to call us that, in that regard. Nobody's stopping somebody starting up an exploitative clothing brand tomorrow in New Zealand. So I think we do need a more systematic regime in the legislative framework. And I say that with caution. I want countries to be able to develop, to lift themselves out of poverty by having export grade goods and selling them. I'm a bit of an open market man, but I want to see it done in respectable, safe ways that leave people free from exploitation.
Yeah, I think everyone does. So would that lead you to say, if there are cases of modern slavery in supply chains, then maybe the New Zealand government should look at not allowing those imports from those producers or those areas until they were able to show that it was free from slavery?
we don't always enjoy the US's leadership in the world, but one thing it does quite well is move first on these things, and the long arm of the US law can occasionally reach for the right things, and I think if that's well proven, we should follow suit. That should be all the evidence we need that those rubber gloves shouldn't be on our shelves either. I mean, it's interesting. Rubber has a long history of exploitation, going back to the Belgian King Leopold in the Congo, bringing ivory and rubber. It was a shipping manager out of the northwest of the UK in Liverpool, who is an interesting story. Who found out that it was guns and soldiers in one direction and ivory and rubber in the other, and the King of Belgium was not exactly improving the lot of the Congolese. He was raping and pillaging, and that really exposed the scale of the exploitation. Here we are, 250 years later, really no change in the rubber market.
And hopefully there'll be some more focus on trafficking to expose those involved in that trade. Yeah. Good. We will probably wrap up soon, but let me give you both a chance to add a closing comment and anything else you'd like people to know, because I mean we could be talking for hours.
We could keep going for ages on this, and one area that we've not touched on, because this is an unsavoury topic generally, but we typically stay away from the porn and the sexual side of things. And I found it somewhat disturbing to learn through another, actually, it was a Tearfund memo or update that said when borders closed, you'd think that might have helped the situation. It actually made it worse, because it just drove more and more tailored and specific content being created online for the dark web, but it also finds its way onto the mainstream web more freely than we would like to care or admit. And consumers of adult content, should we say, are very likely to be participating, probably unknowingly, but there's a lot of that content around on the web, and this is it's fuel for the industry. And so I suppose what my closing comment would be that there's a lot that we can do in this area. We at Nikko Asset Management, we've got no skills in the specifics of dealing with these issues. What we'd like to say is that we care about this. We want to see change. We'll think about these issues in how we manage assets generally, but specifically in the Freedom Fund. If people care about this too, and you've got some money sitting in a bank account earning low or little interest, would you let us manage it for a period of time to generate some returns that we can give all of that upside through to Tearfund so that they continue their good work? If you get behind us, we can get behind them, and we can get some change.
Okay, thank you, George.
I'll repeat the sales pitch and I'll build on that issue. What Nikko AM have done is truly impressive. You don't always hear an investment firm willing to talk about porn, exploitation, human trafficking. George is absolutely right. 60% of the cases we now deal with our partners globally are online exploitation. They're bespoke orders from the West into Asia for exploitation during a time of COVID. The worrying part is larger and larger numbers of those cases, perpetrators intend to follow up in person. Thailand opened its borders for tourists again on the 1st of November. Some of those tourists coming in on a plane have been exploiting Thai and Southeast Asian children online, and they intend to follow up now in person. So that's the nature of the problem we're up against, and I just commend Nikko AM and any investor out there who would like to participate together. Let's go after this problem.
Great. Thank you both very much, and thank you for your great work. And it's really, in a way, a sort of a difficult and somewhat thankless task. So congratulations to you for that work, Ian, and thanks for your support of them, George.
Cheers, Barry.
Thanks also to the sponsors for this seminar series, which is sponsored by AMP, Booster, Generate KiwiSaver, Harbour Asset Management, and Nikko AM. So particular thanks also to our audience. Next week, we are shifting gear. We're talking about primarily about climate change, but we're talking about particularly the way that fund managers can engage with the companies and their portfolios on climate change. So when they invest in companies they can put pressure on those companies to reduce their emissions. So we're going to hear from a fascinating panel. It's the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, represented by Doug Bell, Laura Hillis from a group called Climate Action 100 Plus, and that's a group. We're talking to the head of the Australian operation, and they act as a coordination point for engagement on climate change. So we're really looking forward to that. And the third panelist is the head of Australia for BlackRock. And BlackRock, as many of you may know, is the world's largest asset manager, has been very high profile in calling for funds to do more on these kind of issues. So it's going to be a fascinating panel. We're really looking forward to it. Please sign up on the website for it and sign up for the series while you're about it. So see you online then. Ka kite anō.